And right now we're going to get into more baseball talk along with some conversation about DraftKings' new fantasy game, MLB Showdown. We got MLB contributor for DraftKings, Garion Thorne, joining me right now on the Boardwalk Honda hotline. Garion, how you doing on this Saturday?
Not too bad, Josh. How's it going on your end?
Doing pretty good. So before we start getting into the specifics of the season, let's get into this MLB Showdown. Basically how it works for those who out there are listening is MLB Showdown allows players to participate in salary cap contests for individual games throughout the regular season and playoffs. Lineups consist of 6 flex players, hitters, and pitchers with 2 key stipulations. Player must include at least 1 player from both teams, and lineups must not have more than 4 hitters from any one team. For full rules and scoring information can be found at DraftKings.com. So, Garen, I know that you're a daily fantasy sports guy, so kind of explain to the folks out there why this MLB Showdown, what makes it so unique? Because obviously when you're only dealing with one game, the whole strategy is very different than if you're gathering from all the games that day. You're only focusing on 2 lineups.
Yeah, I mean, it's a completely different version of DFS. And I think one thing that kind of helps promote, why you would maybe want to play this type of game is if you are someone who looks at, on a Tuesday or a Friday when we have a full 15-game slate of baseball, that's a little overwhelming. It's tough to kind of break all that down and really be at the same level of some of these people who do this for a living. So this kind of simplifies everything down to, hey, just one game to focus on. Like for tonight's purposes, the showdown game on the evening slate is in Colorado. So it's a fun one. We got Seattle, we got Colorado. So it just makes you ask some different questions. I mean, the big difference that I find between showdown and the classic sort of format is, generally speaking, in DFS, we don't talk at all about the bullpens. We don't talk at all about closing situations. Relievers are involved in showdown because the money starts to get so tight that you might have to use some of these guys. So it's not even just about starting pitcher versus lineup matchups, which is really the lifeblood of classic DFS baseball. This is about trusting whether or not you think how a game script is going to play out. For tonight's purposes, like if you've got John Gray in there, are you going to use possibly a member of the bullpen like a Wade Davis and hope that this game stays close enough where Davis comes in and gets the save? So there's a lot of stuff going on with it. It's kind of a different variation if you're, maybe not bored of the classic style, but are just looking for something new. So I think it really does serve a lot of purposes.
And speaking of guys that you probably want in your lineup, it was on the showdown slate. This guy in Philadelphia, Aaron Nola, is going for his 13th win this afternoon against the Marlins. Incredible season. And for me, Gary, one of the things that stands out to me about Nola is not just the ERA, it's not just the strikeouts. He has been top 5 in wins above replacement among all National League players all year long. You're talking about a pitcher. A guy who only pitches every 5 days is among the leaders in wins above replacement. I mean, Aaron Nola has been absolutely incredible this year.
Oh, he's been fantastic. And really, I mean, any Phillies fan listening right now probably knows and was probably screaming the last couple seasons, like, this guy is an upper echelon starting pitcher. He just didn't exactly get the national recognition that I think he's starting to get this season. And he deserves it. He deserves every part of it. I mean, you go through any one of the numbers you want to go through, a 2.63 FIP, that's pristine. That's amazing. And he's also part of a very special class of pitcher, not something we see a whole lot of now, especially with the launch angle generation currently happening in baseball. But he's one of very few pitchers, qualified pitchers, who has over a strikeout per inning and a ground ball rate above 50%. Like, that combination is really just, it is the pinnacle for most pitchers. I mean, that's what you want to have happen. You want to mitigate contact as much as possible, and if they do happen to make contact, you want to keep that ball on the ground to really kind of mitigate the extra base hit factor. But he has been fantastic, and really, across the last 2 months specifically, he had kind of a strange run to start the season. Not that he was bad in any way, but he faced the Braves off the hop like 3 straight times
Yep.
or 3 times in 5 games, and his strikeout numbers weren't really there, and everyone was kind of like, oh, what's going on with Aaron Nola? Is he broken? Where are the strikeouts? It's like, no, the Braves just don't strike out. As soon as he's played anyone that wasn't the Braves.
Well,
the strikeouts have
also
come back
when you're
flush.
playing the same team 3 times, they recognize you. They know what you're going to do. So it's hard to strike somebody out if they've seen you 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, interdivisional rivalries, that stuff's going to happen, but his stuff has looked fantastic across, well, the entire season, really, but especially those last 2 months.
Do you think Aaron Nola should be the starter Tuesday night for the National League All-Star team?
I think he's got a case. I mean, it's tough. I think this year, more than any year I can remember, we've seen just a crazy level of starting pitcher. Now, again, that kind of speaks a little bit to the way baseball is transitioning. I mean, it seems like we are in an era where hitters are selling out for power, which, it's big upside, but more often than not, that ends poorly for a particular hitter or a hitter not of a certain caliber. So you do have just pitcher after pitcher after pitcher with incredible returns. I mean, I would probably say I'd have to lean DeGrom just for how crazy his year has been, but Nola's on that short list, which is incredible to think about.
In terms of daily fantasy or just even regular fantasy, I play a year-round fantasy baseball league, and you look at guys like Pivetta and Velasquez. These are 2 guys who are over 10 in strikeouts per 9 innings, but their ERAs are high. So, for fantasy baseball, how do you balance the desire to get a guy who's going to pile up the strikeouts versus basically playing roulette and hoping that tonight's not the night the guy gives up 5, 6 runs?
Well, I think Velasquez in particular is kind of an interesting case because I think he has a very, not obvious tell necessarily, but with his struggles against left-handed batters, you can kind of formulate a theory when it comes to streaming. You look at, not that he would play like Texas all that often or anything like that, but you go through and you find lineups where how left-handed dependent are they? Not even just how many left-handed batters are going to come to the plate on a given night, but at what quality are those left-handed batters? So sometimes you can find spots, like in particular, I know it's easy to cherry pick this one, but his last start against the Mets, I mean, not only did that come against a team who has obviously struggled to produce offensively so far this season, but you looked at the lineup that the Mets put out on that particular night, no Brandon Nimmo, no Asdrubal Cabrera. I mean, Matt Den Decker was like the 3rd left-handed bat. Jose Reyes was the 4th left-handed bat in that lineup. And you had a pretty good idea that Vince Velasquez was going to have a pretty solid night. I mean, right. Pivetta, it's a little more complex. I mean, Pivetta is obviously high risk, high reward, but I've always been someone who has had the philosophy in season-long leagues that strikeouts are so much the lifeblood of fantasy baseball that you kind of work backwards from there. I'd rather have a guy with the upside of a Pivetta on my bench to stream in and out than someone who maybe, like an Ivan Nova, someone who might be occasionally fantastic for your ERA or your WHIP, but is really never going to get you those high strikeout upside.
Talking with Garion Thorne, he is a MLB contributor for DraftKings. Of course, you can check out the new MLB Showdown game at DraftKings.com as well as the DraftKings app. Garion, when you also look at the Phillies, when it comes to hitters, when Rhys Hoskins wasn't in the lineup for the Phillies, they only averaged 2.5 runs a game. Since his return from the DL with that unique helmet, the team is averaging almost 5.5 runs a game. Hoskins, in that stretch since he came back from the DL, more home runs than prior to the DL, more RBI than prior to the DL. This is a guy who literally looks like he's rejuvenated. Looks more like the hitter we saw last August and September, post-breaking his jaw, that he did at the beginning of the season. What do you buy into that? Do you think he maybe just needed a break mentally to kind of get back on track? Is that special helmet lucky? What is it?
I mean, hey, I am not one to dispel the luckiness of a particular helmet. It's tough with Hoskins because we're still looking at a guy who doesn't have 600 plate appearances for his career. So I think for as much as we looked at last season and said, wow, these numbers are mind-boggling, we kind of all put to the side that for the last 3 weeks of 2017, Hoskins was kind of in a slump. Like, it seemed like pitchers had started to kind of course correct and really change their approach to Hoskins, and that's probably really what we were seeing at the start of the season as well. And then a young hitter starts pressing. We know how that narrative goes. But I think he is someone who is so important to the context of this lineup, not only because he brings that plus power potential, but even when he is struggling, he's someone who, with his walk rate and his on-base percentage, can be a jumpstart. I mean, he can be a catalyst for this lineup as well. I mean, obviously you rely so much on Hoskins and Herrera to kind of get the ball rolling, and Cesar Hernandez as well, but I do think he's someone who, even when he isn't hitting for great amounts of power, can be a positive contributor to an offense, just in the fact he gets on base well more often than the average hitter.
Unlike the American League, where the American League is top-heavy with three monsters, the Red Sox, the Yankees, and the Astros, in the National League, you look around the whole league, you got 7 teams that all have at least 50 wins right now. It's the Phillies and the Braves in the NL East. In the NL Central, it's the Cubs and the Brewers. And in the West, it's the Dodgers, the Diamondbacks, and the Giants. So the National League is wide open. So I ask you, Garion, which of the young teams do you think has better staying power, the Phillies or the Braves?
I think if we're talking for 2018 specifically, I'd have to lean Phillies. And I do think a big part of this, and I guess this is, I'm not exactly reinventing the wheel here, but the first thing I tend to look at, which is the viability and the sustainability of success, especially in the regular season, is depth and quality of starting pitching. And I think the Phillies have that in spades above their competition in the NL East, aside from maybe a healthy Nationals team. But health has obviously never been exactly the strength of the Nationals over the last 3 or 4 seasons. But, you know, aside from Aaron Nola, who might be a top 3 pitcher in the National League, you do have, I mean, I know strikeouts have not exactly been amazing for Jake Arrieta this season. He's kind of transformed the type of pitcher he is. He's more contact-oriented, kind of like a mid-2000s pitcher this season. But, I mean, he is someone who generates the types of contact you want. He's a ground ball-oriented pitcher, soft contact rate exceedingly high as well. And he's someone who is a solid number 2 option, regardless of the context of your team. And even someone like Zach Eflin. I mean, Zach Eflin has had such an incredible season and has become he's had such ability to neutralize not only right-handed bats, but, I mean, you'll remember the cups of coffee prior, left-handed bats were really his sticking point, and those haven't seemed to be an issue so far this season. His fastball just has this amazing life on it. I think the depth they can throw out there, and that's not even including a Vince Velasquez, he's capable of he's got ace stuff. He's capable of having huge nights, and that's your 4. Like, I think regardless of who they send to the mound, the Phillies have a chance to win every single night based upon the depth of their starting pitching, and that's such an important factor when it comes to regular season playoff races.
One of the conversational points in this area has been about Manny Machado. We know the Phillies have been in talks. We've heard rumors about the Yankees, rumors about the Brewers, rumors about the Dodgers. I want to ask you the question that we've been asking a lot of people in this area, Garion. If you're a team and you know Manny Machado is going to hit free agency next year, is it worth sacrificing all of these prospects, all of these young players, to get a second-half rental who arguably could be extremely expensive get if he doesn't re-sign with you in the offseason?
Well, the Phillies are in a very unique spot. I think their spot is maybe more unique than any of these other teams that are bidding for the services of Manny Machado because, as you mentioned, there is the risk. Obviously, there's risk involved in trading away 2 or 3 high-caliber prospects for 2 months of a hitter, regardless of how good that hitter actually is. And Manny Machado, we know, is of the highest caliber. But I do think the Phillies are a place that, I mean, even if he's not traded to Philadelphia this season, the Phillies are going to be a destination that's talked about in free agency. Like, there's no reason the Phillies can't re-sign Manny Machado. So I do think if you are the Phillies organization, you look at it from that perspective, that this is not the type of team that necessarily you need to go all in on. Like, this is the Phillies are arriving early. Like, we thought that maybe 2019, definitely 2020, was going to be the window when they started competing for championships and making the playoffs. It's happening early. So you don't want to necessarily sell the future for a guy to help before your window's even really necessarily open. But again, I do think they've got a chance to definitely re-sign him if they want to, and they can put on a 2-month sales pitch essentially for why he'd want to sign in Philadelphia. And if you look at this team as well, the two major areas of weakness when it comes to just straight up WAR positionally, they are 25th in baseball in shortstop WAR and 27th in baseball in third base WAR. And I mean, Maikel Franco is coming around in the month of July, and I think I would trust him above all the other names. But, you know, Kingery, everyone still has faith that Scott Kingery is going to be a very good baseball player, but it's rookie season. He's had a tough go right now. J.P. Crawford in a similar boat, just not quite ready to produce probably in a pennant race. I mean, you stick Machado in essentially what is your position of biggest weakness. I mean, that's got to look appealing, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, for a lot of people in this area, they look at Machado and they're all worried no matter what, you know, because, you know, Philadelphia, it's naturally a worrying town, right? You know, it's a town that's not used to success despite the Eagles winning the Super Bowl, despite the Phillies won the World Series 10 years ago. It's a town that's not used to success. There's a part of them that says, well, what are we more comfortable with? We're more comfortable with getting an inexpensive second half run on than we are spending the farm for a guy who they may worry is going to leave in the offseason. That leads me to my next question for you. If you're the Phillies, instead of investing all of these prospects into getting Machado, do you instead call the Rangers and say, how about we take Hamels and Adrian Beltre off your hands for a package of players that's going to cost you a lot less in the long run than going all in for Machado at the trade deadline?
I mean, it might not be a terrible way to go. And like you say, that is a sort of situation that is clearly more oriented for, okay, it'd be nice to make the playoffs. We're trying to make the playoffs. We're indicating to our players even as a front office that we trust this group can make the playoffs. We're adding to it. We're trying to help. So it's a good clubhouse move as well. And obviously bringing Cole Hamels back to Philadelphia is not a move that anyone would frown upon. But it is a different version of Cole Hamels. And not that, as I mentioned, the Phillies necessarily need that much help in their starting pitching. But, you know, Hamels is part of this has been Texas. And I guess that is the optimistic view to take about the possibility of trading for Cole Hamels, is that if you look at his numbers, 374 WOBA pitching in Texas, 14 home runs in 54 innings pitching in Texas. The numbers get a whole lot better when he doesn't have to pitch in the heat at Arlington. So you could make an optimistic case that Hamels just needs a change of location to get everything back. But, you know, I do think that it's a stopgap maneuver. Beltre in the same right, fantastic hitter, still a good defender. You know, it's nice that he's still in the American League for the sense that Texas can hide him occasionally at DH. Like, I'm not sure if he's still someone you want to put out there 7 days a week. So I'm not saying he's AL dependent, but he is definitely someone who I think in the future would look to stay in the American League for the benefit of having the DH and a half day off every now and again. But it's not a bad move necessarily. I just don't think it obviously has the upside of a Machado thing. And I go back to the fact that I do think the Phillies boil down to one of 3 or 4 destinations that just make sense for Machado in 2019.
MLB contributor for DraftKings, Garion Thorne, joining us on the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline here on 97.3 ESPN. Couple more games before I let you go. Let's flip over to the American League. We know that the Red Sox, Yankees, and Astros are the monsters of the American League. But tonight on 97.3 ESPN, we will be bringing the folks the Indians versus the Yankees. The Indians are a team that are just a couple of years removed from a World Series appearance. Lately, though, their bullpen has not been pitching well. They got great hitters. They got Ramirez. They got Lindor. They got all these hitters. But it's the bullpen, which was a strength for them a couple of years ago, has been giving them problems. How far gone is that bullpen? Is it just a temporary issue, or do they need to go all in at the trade deadline to fix up that pitching staff?
Here's what I would say about the Indians specifically. And this is a very unique case, as you talk about, because this was not a perceived problem for the Indians coming into 2018. I mean, Andrew Miller's injuries have not helped, clearly. But this is a bullpen that not only has the worst ERA of any bullpen in baseball, but Francona has noticed this clearly. I mean, they are used more infrequently than any other bullpen in baseball as well. Here's what I would say, though. They're in a very interesting spot where the AL Central is easily the worst division in baseball. There is no question that they are going to win the AL Central this year. So I don't think there's any urgency necessarily that we have to make a move at the deadline to bring in someone to help shore up this pen so that we can even make the playoffs. They know they're making the playoffs. The reason I don't think they're going to make a massive move is if you look at the history of what the Indians have done in the playoffs recently, specifically their run to the World Series a couple years back that was thwarted by the Cubs. I remember the American League Championship Series. It was a 5-game series against the Toronto Blue Jays. They used 3 pitchers 51% of the plate appearances they had in that series, and it was Andrew Miller, Corey Kluber, and Cody Allen. You can do that kind of stuff in the playoffs with how the schedule sort of plays out. You only really need 3, maybe 4 starters, and if that's the case, I mean, maybe they can even move like a Clevenger into the bullpen for the playoffs, and then with a healthy Andrew Miller, you get in a situation where between Carrasco, between Kluber, between maybe a stretch mid-innings guy like Clevenger, and then with Miller and Cody Allen to finish things off, I think it's a lot simpler to get it done with only 3 or 4 pieces in your bullpen in the playoffs than it is in the regular season when you can't be using these guys 3 consecutive days. So I'm actually not that worried about the bullpen for the Indians when it comes to the grand scheme of things, and they're just going to win the Central. Like, it's as easy as that.
Garion Thorne joining us on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline here on 97.3 ESPN. And again, it's called MLB Showdown. The way it works, you get to play 1 game. So you only get to use the lineups of the 1 game. 6 flex players, hitters and pitchers. Player must include at least 1 player from both teams and may not have more than 4 hitters on any one team. For more rules and scoring information, go to DraftKings.com. You also can play on the DraftKings app. Garion, go ahead and tell the folks again what tonight's MLB Showdown game is for them to get involved in this.
Yeah, so tonight's game, again, it's an exciting one. We've got the Coors Field effect in play. It is Seattle at Colorado, and I will say, just for people constructing lineups, this is a Captain Obvious thing, but if you're overlooking, the Trevor Stories and Nolan Arenados of the world tonight, Wade LeBlanc, who is starting this game for the Mariners, an 11.3% strikeout rate over his last 4 games. That is putrid. You do not want to be allowing a lot of contact at Coors Field. Trevor Story, 482 ISO at home against lefties this season. Nolan Arenado, 509 isolated power against lefties at home this season. They're expensive, but there's some ways you can work them in there. So it's a fun game tonight. I highly recommend, if you haven't tried Showdown yet, this will be a very fun, interesting game to kind of wet your beak.
Of course, you can check it out at DraftKings.com or on the DraftKings app. It's called MLB Showdown. He is Garion Thorne, MLB contributor for DraftKings, joining us on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline here on 97.3 ESPN. Gary, appreciate your time on a Saturday.
No worries, Josh. Have a good one, man.